is Strategic Development Director. Along with a couple of my colleagues, I'm going to be running you through a short presentation, which should take around sort of 25 minutes or so to run through, and then we'll take some Q&A at the end. So that Q&A will be done via questions that you type in to the GoToWebinar functionality, and we'll pick them up at the end on there. So if you want to submit your questions as we're going along, we will pick those up at the end. You're all on mute at the moment, so we can't sort of hear anyone speaking on those side of things. The webinar is also being recorded, so for those of you who want to sort of revisit it or maybe share it with colleagues, you will be sent a link shortly after the webinar finishes, once we have a recording available to be shared from that point. So just in terms of who's presenting the webinar today, there's myself, was already mentioned. My colleague Paul Greenwood, the Operations Director, will talk through particularly how we're carrying out some of the remote assessments, some of the feedback that we've been receiving on that. And Caroline will compare the Q&A session at the end, putting your questions to Paul and myself. So in terms of what we're aiming to achieve from this webinar, what we'd like to be able to do here hopefully is communicate and explain our approach to remote assessments to you, share some of the feedback that we've been getting as we've been going through this, and provide some opportunity for Q&A there. And we'll do that in terms of the structure. We'll just have a quick run through of what UKAS's current policy is. We'll spend the bulk of the presentation talking through remote assessments and how they're structured and work, and the technology, and how certain challenges such as the technical activities, the witnessing of those will be covered. A quick look at some guidance documents that you may find useful before we go into feedback and Q&A. So this is our sort of current policy around what we're doing at this time. Obviously, the relative inability of UKAS to attend sites to conduct assessments means that we are doing virtually all of our assessments remotely at the moment, and that will be the case until at least the 1st of October 2020. This is, UKAS has always done some parts of its assessment remote. We've done document reviews for extensions to scope. We've done document reviews as preparation for assessment, but we did back in the middle of March, we moved all of our assessment to being remote almost overnight. We did have a project underway, a bit more of a longer term project, but that was, we took what we had from there and launched that within about a week. And obviously some things were a little bit bumpy in that first week. So if there's any customers on this webinar who were with us in that first week, thank you very much for your patience and for bearing with us during that time. But since then, we've learned a lot. We are still learning a lot, and we're improving as we go along in there. But obviously, why did we do that? Well, clearly, there was a need to make sure that the health and safety of our staff, our contractors, and our customers was protected as much as possible at that time. And we felt, under the guidance that was from the government on there wasn't a need for us to be attending site to carry out our assessments, that we could do an effective assessment remotely and still maintain that trust and confidence that was needed in the marketplace in there. We have said that we will focus around surveillance and reassessment. Our priority is making sure that accreditation is maintained during this time, but that doesn't mean that we're not open to new applications, be they for an extension to scope or a completely new customer. New work does present some challenges, particularly if it does require some on-site witnessing, but there is a lot we can do to get ready, and there's definitely a lot we can do with the technology as well to replace that on-site assessment and get those extensions or new applications assessed and through. We have been, obviously UKAS as well has been looking at and assessing a number of organisations that are providing testing in support of the response to COVID-19, and in those cases we have done some minimal on-site assessing where we've deemed it critical to getting those applications through to support that effort within the UK. And obviously all UKAS's staff are working from home as well, so we do We've always had about 2/3 of our workforce as remote workers anyway, but we've moved the whole workforce to working from home currently as well. So that's our current policy. And how does that sort of fit into remote assessments? Because there's lots of different scenarios out there, lots of different ways in which our customers are operating at the moment. So some organisations are operating still fully on site, obviously with the necessary precautions and in place and safety, thinking of social distancing and that of their staff, but they're still operating fully on site. Some have got a bit of a mix. They've some of their staff that they felt they don't need to be on site are working from home, and those whose roles cannot be done at home are still being done on site. So they have a bit of a mix. And some, mainly sort of certification bodies that can do and offer their service fully remote, have, similar to UKAS, moved to all of their staff working fully from home on there. And obviously, some organisations have been particularly challenged by the current situation and have taken the decision to furlough the majority of their staff, and they maybe only have a bit of a skeleton staff in place at the moment, keeping the business ticking over. In all of those situations, remote assessment is possible. The type of remote assessment we do, the extent of remote assessment we can do varies quite a bit in those situations, but it is possible in all of them. And one of the key reasons that we want to do that, even for an organisation that's maybe taken the decision to kind of put their business on hold for a little while by furloughing a lot of their staff, is that we want to ensure when the time comes for the business to come back up and to ramp back up, that they do that with accreditation in place, that they aren't in a position of needing UKAS to approve and check things before they can start offering their services fully accredited back out to their customers again. So we want to do what we can during this time to make sure that accreditation is maintained. So obviously where people are still fully working on site, or there's a mix of home and on-site working, we can view technical activities, and we'll come to how we do that using technology later. Where people are working from home, the use of web conferencing technology has the ability to bring lots of people together for the discussions that we need and the assessment that can be done quite effectively remotely in that way. Obviously, anyone who's been through a UKAS assessment will know that a significant part of it is looking at records of what has been happening over the last 12 months. We marry that up with information we get about how the organisation is currently performing to give ourselves confidence that you will continue to perform in a competent and compliant way. So even if the majority of the organisation staff have been furloughed, as long as there are still some staff there who have access to the record system and can talk us through that, we can look back through historic records of work, historic records of things like staff training and proficiency testing and other activities like that, which will give us confidence to maintain accreditation during this time. So that purpose, what we're aiming the remote assessments at, we can't always do everything that we've done previously on site. So one of our main aims is ensuring that the standards are being upheld and we can maintain that trust and confidence in the marketplace. Many organisations are still continuing to operate at this time, but they're operating in very challenging situations. They may have reduced staff. They will almost definitely have had to modify some of their procedures and ways of operating to deal with the necessary health and safety precautions in there. They may well have had their supply chains disrupted, and usual supplies and services that they would be using to perform their activities are not available, and they've had to go to new ones within there. So with these challenges in place, but people still relying upon what conformity assessment bodies are doing, we feel it's important that the assurance that accreditation provides to not only to the organisation we're assessing, but to their customers and to their stakeholders remains in place. And also that accreditation remains there, so that when businesses do start up again in earnest, they do so with their accreditation intact, and they're not having to wait on UKAS to get things back up and running again. So thinking about the remote assessments and how they look for anyone who's not had one yet. actually a lot of it will feel quite similar to how previous assessments you've had done on site. Yeah, we will still have opening and closing meetings. There will still be a lead and technical assessors working together as a team. We will still be reviewing records, just as I talked about a moment ago. Yeah, we will still be looking through those records in there, maybe live through screen sharing, maybe remotely through information that's been sent to us in advance of the assessment. We will still be witnessing some activities, probably by live stream or recording in there, but we will be looking at the witnessing of that. That is probably the most challenging aspect of a remote assessment, and we will come on to that in a little bit more detail later. And we'll still want to have some discussions with you on specific issues. So, you know, there will be, within the remote assessment, there will be sort of pairings off or one-to-one or two-to-one meetings between members of our assessment team and members of your teams to talk about specific topics, the same way as things happen currently on site at the moment. But there will be some key differences in there. This is what we've sort of seen from here. What we found doesn't work well is sort of trying to sit on an 8-hour Microsoft Teams or Zoom call and have the whole team on there the whole time and everyone sort of trying to engage and backwards and forwards. That doesn't work very well. Actually, what works better is sort of short, focused interaction between members of the team and the customer, and followed by periods where perhaps we review the information that you provided to us, go through the records that have been submitted before coming back with another set of questions in there. So you won't, whereas you're probably familiar with an on-site assessment of someone from your team engaging with someone from the assessment team at all times, that's unlikely to happen in a remote assessment. And that opens up the opportunity there, then the assessment doesn't need to be confined to a sort of 8-hour blocks of days. It could be, you know, 1 day's worth of assessment could be split up into 2 or 3 or 4 smaller blocks that are spread over a longer period of time. And sometimes we've found that our customers need that. Everyone's working in quite challenging circumstances at the moment, and people's working hours are not routine. They need flexibility to cope with things like childcare and other activities that are happening. And this fragmentation of the assessment can help to do that where it is needed. It's not always needed, but it does open that opportunity up. And both those things mean that we probably need a bit more of a detailed and structured plan of when meetings are needed to bring members of the assessment team, members of the customer team back together at key points during the assessment. Obviously, that's quite easy on site, just to sort of round people up into a room to have a discussion. It needs a little bit more planning and structuring with a remote assessment. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the technology that we would be using from here. We've been using a number of different technology platforms, but what we've sort of quite quickly focused in on after the first few weeks was that actually Microsoft Teams seems to be the most stable, the most accepted platform that we can use for this purpose on here. It's worth saying, you know, that I know not everyone will have Microsoft Teams available to them and be using it, but it is a technology that UKAS has the full licenses to. You don't need to have the application to be able to join the meeting. You can join over a web interface if you need to on there, but that is, yeah, so no one's got to buy any licenses to be able to take part in these meetings on here. But obviously you do need to be able to access that, and we know that in some organizations the restrictions on IT mean that people might not be able to access and use Microsoft Teams. So we do have some alternative platforms that we can use. We can use Skype, although you know, we've seen that is not as stable on the particularly around video calling as Microsoft Teams is. We can use GoToMeeting. We're using GoToWebinar here. We have access to GoToMeeting, and we can use Zoom as well. I know sort of early on there were some security questions raised about Zoom. Zoom have done quite a bit to address those, but I know some organizations will still have concerns about using it. So I think the key thing to say is that really any of these platforms, if we're using them, will be used in agreement with the customer that this is an acceptable web conferencing platform for them. Ultimately as well, if you as a customer have got your own platform, you're not able to access these and you have your own platform that you want us to use, as long as we can access that, we will look to use it. It does make things a little bit more challenging. So obviously, with us not being in charge of arranging the meetings, it's sometimes a bit hard. We have to use an alternative solution for our teams and things, our assessment team, to get together. But it is possible in the situations where none of these options are acceptable to your business. A large element of what we need to do with remote assessment is around the file sharing. Now, some of that can be done on screen, but actually reviewing large documents through a file share is not a great and effective use of everyone's time. It's all right to just sort of quickly go through and maybe point out some specific points in a document that you're both looking at and discussing. But for an assessor to do a kind of file review of a piece of work that's performed, it's not necessarily the most effective way to do it. That's better done offline. And what we've been looking to use for that is using Dropbox as a file sharing solution. So again, security-wise, we're not using the free version of Dropbox, which doesn't have the security on it that the licensed version does. So we have a licensed version of Dropbox, and we will set up a Dropbox area for the assessment, which the teams and you can access to share information through there, and then that will be closed down once it's no longer needed in that area. Ultimately, we know sometimes the IT solutions don't always work, or internet connections on the day can be a bit patchy. We do have some fallback solutions. We can go to teleconferencing for the talking, for the discussion, and we can go to email for the file sharing. Email file sharing can be a bit more problematic. Large file sizes can get bounced by servers and things like that, so it can be a bit more time consuming. So it is a bit of a fallback solution, but it can be used where the other solutions are not working or are not acceptable in there. So that's a quick run through technology, and at this point I'd like to hand over to my colleague Paul, who's going to start to talk you through the structure of some of the assessments.
Thanks, Jeff. Hopefully everyone can hear me. Yeah, I think taking over, thank you for starting it off. One thing I would say is that we're kind of repeating this webinar for those customers where originally you thought we would be back on site from the 1st of July. So there may be some customers on here who have already participated in one of these webinars expecting a lot different. What I would say to those people is just stay with us, because there might be some different Q&A at the end, and keep an eye on our FAQ on the website. But this is essentially the same webinar, just to bring those people who've got assessments between July and October up to speed with what we're doing. That kind of leads into my first point. When we first switched over, as Jeff indicated, we did that pretty much overnight, and there was a lot of toing and froing between customers and our assessment managers, and a lot of fraught conversations. And in some cases, we were talking to people very sort of close to the assessment that was taking place. Now that people have got this mechanism of working under their belts, they're much more comfortable to organise the visits a little bit further out. So I would be expecting your assessment manager to be contacting you several weeks before the assessment to go through all of those discussion points, agreeing what mechanisms you're going to use, how you're going to interact, and the visit planning, where at the very beginning of lockdown we didn't have that luxury, and so things were very hand to mouth. Saying that, if you haven't heard and you're thinking, well, I've got an upcoming assessment and I've not really heard anything, please do contact your assessment manager. They'll be only too grateful to hear from you. They are busy, obviously, conducting assessments, but they are generally more contactable because they're all working from home. As Jeff has stressed in the previous segment that he was talking about, please do test the technology, and by all means, please test it yourselves before we get talking, to make sure that you've got access to those facilities. But obviously, we would like to conduct some kind of tests before we do the assessment, just to make sure it's going to run smoothly. That doesn't need to take too long. But as I say, if we just go straight into an assessment without having tested the platforms, we will run into issues. Again, the assessment managers have been tasked with making sure that you're clear as to what information needs to be available. Hopefully they will have requested documents up front so that they don't have to spend too much time sort of poring over those or requesting them, and you're off looking through systems or pulling out detailed information at their request. But if we can have all of that prepared up front, obviously it saves time for everybody. And I think the big thing also is just chat it through with your teams so they're aware of what's going to happen. I mean, we can try and include them as part of the planning process, but it can get quite heavy if we've got a lot of people that we're talking to. And I think it's particularly those people who will be doing witnessing activities, so that they're clear about what the expectations are and what's been agreed between yourselves and your assessment manager. Okay, so talking about the technical element, what we've seen over the past couple of months is kind of a hierarchy of how we're talking with customers. So ideally, if we're looking at technical activities, we kind of have gone with this 4-tier approach. Perfect situation is that we can watch you conducting those assessments remotely, either through a webcam or even through a mobile phone if you're on site, that kind of thing. And we've actually found that works really, really well, because we can talk to the person who's conducting the activity, we can zoom in, zoom out, all of those kinds of things. Obviously appreciating that in certain circumstances it's impossible to do your activity one-handed while you're recording yourself. So again, just thinking about how we can do that. We've also seen a lot of people who have pre-recorded witnessing of activities. So they've had somebody who has recorded somebody in a laboratory or conducting an assessment or some certification activity. They've taken somebody out with them who's socially distanced, record what they've done. Again, that works really well, but we do need to be able to know when that activity took place. So some information that supports when that recording was produced is obviously really important. If we can't do either of those and actually physically witness what's going on, we can do a vertical audit. And in the certification section, I think many of you would recognise the term post-audit review. And that is an opportunity, as Jeff identified sort of very early on, where we can go through case files, through records, through reports, through investigations and that kind of thing, and look at what's been done. So it's like a document audit, a vertical document audit. And generally when we do that, we would want to be talking to the person who had been involved most heavily in conducting the test or inspection or certification activity. So again, just making them available for that meeting, making sure that they're aware of the kinds of things that we'll be looking at. And again, we can do all of this just by phone. If we can't get any of these platforms to work, there's an opportunity here that we can talk to your staff and talk through their understanding of what's happened. So even if you've sent across files to us, we can talk through those technically with the people who are most involved in the testing, inspection or certification. I think remote assessment is obviously the most challenging part of the whole assessment. And if we can't see things, or there are critical or very high risk areas of activity, it may be that we just defer those and come back in when everybody's able to accommodate us and we're able to actually visit your site. But again, it's very important that we do discuss and agree how we're going to do this before we embark on the assessment. So following the assessment, as Jeff said, it's pretty much business as usual. You will receive your normal report, which will identify who was involved in the assessment. It will have all of those key features that we normally include, so the executive summary and an outline of the outcome of the visit, the recommendation. It will cover all of the information that we've looked at technically and obviously any findings or areas of improvement that we've identified. Obviously, there will be a section at the very end, which is next steps. And in the next steps, it will identify if there is anything that we need to come back and see. We'll identify that and make sure that that's very clearly stated in there so that you're aware of whether there is any further additional assessment that takes place. Again, as Jeff said, our aim is to try and complete all of these assessments remotely where we can. Clearance of improvement actions, that's as normal. I think we've had a lot of questions that actually, because we've got a lot of staff on furlough, we can't address all these actions, or we can't get on site to make those clearances. So, you know, we're going to be pragmatic, have that discussion as part of your assessment, and certainly at the closing meeting when the closeout dates are agreed. You know, we're going to have to be flexible as to when you can actually physically submit the corrective actions to clear any findings or improvements that we've identified. And you know, we're going to be mindful of how you can do that. I think the other concern that we've had voiced to us is, well, my accreditation's due to expire. I'm in my renewal year. I'm really concerned. We can extend accreditation, and it's actually at a section head level. So each of my section heads has the authority to extend accreditation by up to 6 months. We can extend by a further 6 months in extenuating circumstances, and that's a review that we take at a more senior level. But when we do renew, we will renew back to the original renewal date. So, you know, you're not going to expire as a consequence of us not being able to come on site. You know, we can reassure you of that. There are a lot of guidance documents. We already had in place a technical policy statement, which was pretty specifically in relation to certification activities. That was TPS 62, and that was based on the IAF document ID3, which is a little bit further down. But we have drafted up, and it has now been published, another technical policy statement, TPS 73, which relates specifically to the COVID-19 lockdown the pandemic situation. So please do have a look at that TPS 73. It's got some really useful information in there. The IAF, ID and MD documents are very useful, very helpful if you're conducting remote audits yourselves, but they'll also give an idea of the kind of thinking that we've had to put in place to help us conduct our remote assessments. And I mean, there are a lot of documents on our website as well where we've given guidance on how we will be doing things. Obviously a huge list of FAQs. I think we're up to well over 40 FAQs have been answered or in the process of being answered and being updated every day. And these webinars feed those FAQ lists. And I can see on my second screen a number of questions have come in, so I'm sure we'll get around to those in a moment. Generally, well, overwhelmingly, I think the feedback has been incredibly positive. We monitor feedback very closely, and we score it. Our score during lockdown has increased from 50, which is a good score, up to 70, which is classed as a world-class feedback score. So we're really proud of the way that our assessment managers have stepped up to remote assessment, and really pleased that customers have embraced it, worked with it, fed back to us. That's really important to us, because obviously, whilst a lot of this is positive, a lot of really useful comments have come out, some really good areas of improvement. Jeff's already covered them, but rather than using email for file sharing, using Dropbox. So we have implemented and really kind of pushed with our assessment managers use of Dropbox, and also things like sitting on the phone with an assessment manager in periods of silence. Well, again, break up our assessments so that we're just talking about the things that we found as part of our review, rather than having people just sitting waiting. So some really, really positive information has come out of here, and I think my mantra is that this has caused a door to be opened that's never going to be shut. So, you know, looking at this, we had already got a strategic project in place to look at a more risk-based approach and doing more remote assessment, and that will certainly continue into the future, and is a very hot topic for Jeff and I to be discussing, and we have an executive objective to provide that. So watch out for more of the same. Hopefully, if you have an assessment coming up over the coming months, it runs smoothly. Please do feedback. If you're not hearing anything from your assessment manager, please do get in touch with your assessment manager. If you're having trouble getting through to your assessment manager for whatever reason, we have an info line, so you can send an email to info@UKAS, and they will escalate it through our normal escalation process. And just to say thank you very much, stay safe, and I'm going to hand over to Caroline, who will have a look through some of the questions and hopefully pass them to Jeff first, so I can have a look at some of the questions. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Paul. There are a couple of questions that come in, but actually they came in before you had your talk, Paul. So some have actually been covered. There are a couple here that I'll go through. So one is from Laura. In terms of the technical assessments, will there be the same number as previously, or are there likely to be less? And the second part is, in the tiered approach, is it considered the gold standard to have a live stream for assessment?
Okay, so I'll pick that one up. In terms of will we be covering as many technical activities as we did before, the aim that we're trying to do is to do all of the assessment remotely if we can. That is not always possible. Sometimes the activities are just no longer being performed. Sometimes the ability to see those is just not really there. But what we can do is something to make sure that, to assure ourselves around the competence. And that tiered approach that Paul outlined is all of those things there are about UKAS being able to gain confidence in the competence of your organisation. A live streaming gold standard, I think it's the best approach at this time to enable us to remotely be able to get that confidence and competence on there. It is can be challenging to set up. Not always locations that people are working at and that have that live streaming possible. Social distancing does mean that quite often the technician, the auditor, the inspector needs to be the camera person at the same time, and that probably means they need some kind of sort of stand device for what they're using, as well as being able to direct it. And what people have found is sometimes those sort of small tripods you can get for mobile phones work quite well, because it enables the person to quite easily sort of pick it up and direct it to a small piece of information, or stand it next to them, and therefore have that kind of two-way discussion and audio visual with the assessor during that part. So yeah, I think that the key thing I'd say is it's all about us getting confidence and competence of the organisation, and all those things can do that. But as you sort of go down that tiered approach, the level of confidence we get does diminish, and we might need to do a bit of follow-up later down the line.
Thank you. The next question is, can people request a remote audit instead of a face-to-face once the lockdown is over?
I think it's actually going to become part of our standard approach. Another project that my team is working on at the moment is around what we're sort of terming risk-based assessment, and that will be about evaluating the risk that a customer presents through their history, the way they operate, the sectors they're in, etc. And the outcome of that risk will then give guidance to the teams about how they can approach the assessment, and remote assessment will be an option for all of those, because I don't think at the moment, obviously, we're doing all remote assessment. In the future, it might not be a case of all remote or all on site. It's more likely to be a case of a more blended approach. So you might have some people on site to see some key critical technical activities, but the rest of the assessment is remote on there. So it will be, I think, much more blended, but definitely in some low risk cases we might have some sort of full remote assessments at periods as well.
Okay. That's all the questions, actually. I have also put the FAQ web link in answer to one of the questions. If anybody wants a reminder of what that is, that should be available to everybody. Oh, no, one more question's just come in. I work for a proficiency testing provider and I'm aware that UKAS have a very small number of assessors within that field. If remote assessment is spread over more days than an on-site assessment, might this impact upon keeping within the timeframes?
Actually, no. I think what it will do is make things more flexible. If a large thing that sort of impacts upon the availability of our assessors at the moment is their need to travel to site. And that sort of travel time that was in there, you know, their ability to travel between different locations impacts upon their availability to carry out that work. So with remote assessing and possibly with some slightly fragmented approach, if that's what happens, an assessor over the course of a week could be working on several different customers in sort of 2-hour slots at a time. Or they could, you know, be focused on one customer for a day, depending on how things go. But you know, I think Paul might want to chip in on this one because his team have been doing it, but generally I think our people have been finding that it is helping their availability rather than reducing it.
Yeah, actually the end of that question talks about timeframes for surveillance and reassessment visits. I don't know if what's being talked about is it going to cause a shift in the assessment cycle. I think what it's actually asking is, as you say, is it going to extend meetings? The duration of meetings. It won't extend the duration of meetings. I think the feedback we've been getting is that actually it's much easier for people to cope with spreading it out a little bit because they're not sitting kind of waiting for somebody to, you know, they're not tying up an entire day just sitting waiting to talk to an assessment manager. And again, if you're a very small organisation, and again you've identified you might end up with sort of 2 assessors trying to talk to one person. It gives that that structure. So yeah, as Jeff has said, I think it has actually been beneficial to quite a lot of people. The way that it's slightly differently structured, and people can just get on with what they're doing and then come back. And again, the feedback has been, I felt slightly less pressured because I've not got somebody standing over me waiting for a step of a particular thing to happen. You know, we can just move on. So yeah, I mean, there's pros and cons from both perspectives. I don't think that remote assessment will ever completely replace on-site assessment because the value of that is those things that an auditor sees out of the corner of their eye that you know can bring some of the biggest benefits. But certainly we can use these remote assessments to give us that confidence. I think a few more questions have come in, haven't they, Caroline?
I think they've been covered really.
Okay.
Mainly around thoroughness, etc.
Yeah, there's one here I just sort of pick up. Someone asking whether the remote assessment will involve any change in the fees. UKAS's fee structure is unchanged in this time, but because currently we have a site day does come with it a charge for travel and subsistence expenses off the back of that. I mean that's obviously a charge that's put in there for us to recoup the cost. So that charge doesn't exist on remote days. So actually a remote assessment day is slightly cheaper than a on-site assessment day. So if anything, whilst the kind of day rate is not changing, the overall cost can reduce because of that sort of recovery of expenses not being part of the charges.
Okay, there's a question relating to asbestos testing from David Sykes saying that there's a need to observe a 4-stage clearance to allow for accreditation. These typically take about 5 hours or several days to complete. He's asking how these will be assessed.
Well, we've got a special group of individuals who are tasked with asbestos. So our outward face of asbestos is a gentleman called George Sanders, who's our technical focal point, and they are working with the asbestos sector to clarify all of that sort of area. Again, we have a very clear mechanism within asbestos as to the frequency of 4-stage clearances and how many parts of a 4-stage clearance need to be considered. We are looking at that, have looked at that already, pragmatically. If you've already demonstrated to us a 4-stage clearance in the 4-year cycle, then obviously we've got to take that into account. If there were particular areas which were weaknesses and we said, we will need to see that next year's visit, obviously we would need to look at that and maybe come back and do that in the second half of the year when perhaps availability of assessors and availability of work is there. But again, 4-stage clearances generally are done with full face fit and all the rest of it. So in terms of the risk, it's kind of one-on-one, and it can be done socially distanced. So there shouldn't be a big problem, but obviously we are taking previous performance into account when we're organising all of these visits. And that's on a case-by-case basis.
There's one other question I want to sort of pick up here, which is around sort of suitable equipment needed for live streaming. What I would say there is most people who would be doing live streaming have found it doesn't need hugely specialist equipment. Generally a reasonably good mobile phone camera can be good enough for what we're looking for here, for what is being done. So using some people have been using mobile phones on selfie sticks. I've also mentioned about these sort of small tripods that you can get for mobile phones as well. So you're pretty low cost, low tech equipment, utilizing technology that people should already have in place. Some organizations already have sort of existing webcams and things that they use. Most laptops nowadays will come with webcams built in to them as well. So it's really the technology is there. It doesn't require anything hugely specialist. All of the platforms, the IT platforms that we're using, UKAS holds the licenses to, and they are free to be used at the other end. Sometimes the experience can be better if you have a license yourself, because you get a full application rather than using what can be sometimes a slightly pared down web-based application in there, but it's still perfectly possible to be used. You just lack maybe some of the full functionality. I think, for instance, in Microsoft Teams, they have some nice tools for having kind of blurred or custom backgrounds to you. I don't think that's available on the web application, but it's available on the full application. So, not something that's going to affect our ability to do a remote assessment, but some things that people, extra tools that people may have if they've got the full version on there.
I don't think there's any expectation that people will go out and buy, camera phones or webcams or anything like that. If you haven't got the technology, we need to think about how we do the assessment. Now that might mean that we need to come and do some witnessing later in the year, but it's that kind of that balance, isn't it, of what you've got available. Let's give it a try and do our best. And we've seen some really novel approaches, and everybody's been really helpful to our teams in setting up and conducting the assessments.
One final question is around somebody having a soundproof room that don't have any signal, so live streaming is not possible. Presumably, then you can take a recording.
Yeah, we've seen a lot of that actually, particularly in things like air tightness testing, where it's really either very noisy or difficult to get a signal. So yes, absolutely, recording whatever you can. Again, you may not actually get much sound if it's an anechoic chamber, but yeah, just being able to watch what's happening can be very useful.
It's also, I think, worth saying, whilst sometimes the technology can be an issue, sometimes the security. We've got some customers working in highly confidential situations where they're just not able to live stream stuff. They're not able to share some of this information over the web. In those cases, again, this is where we've got that kind of hierarchy in place. You're falling back to something like a vertical audit of previous work, or a technical interview of the technicians, the inspectors that are involved in that activity. Those things can still give us confidence in the competence of the organisation. You're just recognising that the witnessing is not something that can be done because there might be technological barriers in place. There might also be some security barriers in place. So we feel that for those 4 approaches, there isn't really any that can't be done in some format.
And I think we have the support of the people that we are kind of, we have to demonstrate our technical competence, and we've actually got an upcoming peer evaluation. We've had support from the people who conduct those peer evaluations to say this is an exceptional time, and it really, really is best endeavours. But obviously there are areas of high risk, as I said, where we feel it's not appropriate that we don't do some form of on-site assessment this year. So we will be looking to kind of put those back to the last half of the year wherever possible.
Okay, I think that is that now for questions. I think from our side it remains.
Yeah, it does seem to be that.
Yeah.
Sorry, Caroline, keep talking over each other there.
That's all right. I was going to say, as I said, we've got the link to the FAQs is in the chat box, and obviously when we release them, we do post them on social media, etc. So as and when new ones come up, we'll continue to do that. So if you want to follow us on LinkedIn, that's really the quickest way to know updates. And for now, I would just say thank you to everyone for attending.
Yes, add my thanks to that. Thank you for the questions. Thank you for your time. As Paul's already mentioned, any questions or that about upcoming remote assessments you have, please get in touch with your assessment manager as soon as possible.
Yeah, and I would reiterate my thanks for your attention and engagement, and please do stay safe and well, and we'll see you on the other side.
Okay. So